Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 7 of our reading of the Harvard Classics. And we're going to go over everything that's in this book, and then we will go over, the copyright information. But first of all, we'll be reading from the Harvard Classics, The Apology of Socrates, Phaedo and Crito of Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett, The Golden Sayings of Epictetus, translated by Hastings Crosley, and The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, translated by George Long. This book was edited by Charles W. Eliot, LLD, with introductions and notes. And we're going to go over the copyright information, which says 1980, 1937, and 1907 by Grolier Enterprises Corporation, manufactured in the United States. Anyways, in the last part, we were reading from Phaedo by Plato. And Socrates was explaining why we shouldn't fear death, or why true philosophers shouldn't fear death. And so let's continue. We're going to go back one paragraph exactly, or part of a paragraph. Surely he will, my friend, if he be a true philosopher, for he will have a firm conviction that there only and nowhere else he can find wisdom in her purity. And if this is true, he would be very absurd, as I was saying, if he were to fear death. He would indeed, replied Simmias. And when you see a man who is repining at the approach of death, is not he reluctant to is not his reluctance sufficient proof that he is not a lover of wisdom, but a lover of the body, and perhaps at the same time a lover of either money or power, or both? That is very true, he replied. There is a virtue, Simmias, which is named courage. Is not that a special attribute to the philosopher? Certainly. Again, there is temperance. Is not the calm and control and disdain of the passions, which even the many call temperance, a quality belonging only to those who despise the body and live in philosophy? That is not to be denied. For the courage and temperance of other men, if you will consider them, are really a contradiction. How is that, Socrates? Well, he said, you are aware that death is regarded by men in general as a great evil. That is true, he said. And do not courageous men endure death because they are afraid of yet greater evils? That is true. Then all but the philosophers are courageous, only from fear, and because they are afraid, and yet that a man should be courageous from fear, and because he is a coward, is surely a strange thing. Very, very true. And are not the temperate exactly the same case? They are temperate because they are intemperate, which may seem to be a contradiction, but is nevertheless the sort of thing which happens with this foolish temperance. For there are pleasures which they must have and are afraid of losing, and therefore they abstain from one class of pleasure because they are overcome by another. And whereas intemperance is defined as being under the dominion of pleasure, they overcome only because they are overcome by pleasure. And that is why I mean to say that they are temperate enough. They are temperate through intemperance. That appears to be true. Yet the exchange of one fear or pleasure or pain for another fear or pleasure or pain, which is measured like coins, the greater with the less, is not the exchange of virtue. Oh, my dear Simmias, is there not one true coin for which all things ought to exchange? And that is wisdom. And only in exchange for this and in company with this is anything truly bought and sold, whether courage or temperance or justice. And is not all true virtue the companion of wisdom, no matter what fears or pleasures or other similar goods or evils may or may not attend her? But the virtue, which is made up of these goods, when they are severed from wisdom and in exchanged with one another, is a shadow of virtue only, nor is there any freedom or health or truth in her. But in the true exchange, there is, in purging away of all these things, and temperance and justice, and courage, and wisdom herself are a purgation of these. And I conceive that the founders of the mysteries had a real meaning and were not mere trifles when they intimated in a figure long ago that he who passes unsanctified and uninitiated into the world below will live in a slough, but that he who arrives there after initiation and purification will dwell with the gods, for many, quote unquote, as they say in the mysteries, are the Thyrosis bearers, but few are the mystics. Meaning, as I interpret the words, the true philosophers, in the number of whom I have been seeking, according to my ability to find a place during my whole life, whether I have sought in a right way or not, and whether I have succeeded or not, I shall truly know in a little while, if God will, when I myself arrive in the other world. That is my belief. And now, Simmias and Cebes, I have answered those who charge me with not grieving or repining or parting from you and my masters in this world. And I am right in not repining, for I believe that I shall find other masters and friends who are as good in the world below. But all men cannot believe this, and I shall be glad if my words have any more success with you than with the judges of the Athenians. Cebes answered, I agree, Socrates, in the greater part of what you say, but in what relates to the soul, men are apt to be incredulous. They fear that when she leaves the body, her place may be nowhere, and that on the very day of death she may be destroyed and perish. Immediately on her release from the body, issuing forth like smoke or air and vanishing away into nothingness. For if she could only hold together and be herself after she was released from the evils of the body, there would be good reason to hope, Socrates, that what you say is true. But much persuasion and much arguments are required in order to prove that when the man is dead, the soul yet exists and has any force of intelligence. True, Cebes, said Socrates, and shall I suggest that we talk a little of the probabilities of these things? I am sure, said Cebes, that I should greatly like to know your opinion about them. I reckon, said Socrates, that no one who heard me now, not even if he were one of my old enemies, the comic poets, could accuse me of idle talking about matters in which I have no concern. Let us then, if you please, proceed with the inquiry. Whether the soul of men after death are or are not in the world below is a question which may be argued in this manner. The ancient doctrine of which I have been speaking affirms that they go from this into the other world and return hither, and are born from the dead. Now, if this be true, and the living come from the dead, then our souls must be in the other world, for if not, how could they be born again? And this would be conclusive if there were any real evidence that the living are only born from the dead. But if there is no evidence of this, then other arguments will have to be adduced. That is very true, replied Cebes. Then let us consider this question, not in relation to man only, but in relation to animals generally, and to plants, and to everything in which there is generation. And the proof will be easier. Are not all things which have opposites generated out of their opposites? I mean such things as good and evil, just and unjust, and there are innumerable other opposites which are generated out of opposites. And I want to show that this holds universally of all opposites. I mean to say, for example, that anything which becomes greater must become greater after being less. True. And that which becomes less must have been once greater and then become less. Yes. And the weaker in generate and the weaker is generated from the stronger, and the swifter from the slower. Very true. And the worse from the better, and the more just from the more unjust. Of course. And is this true of all opposites? And are we convinced that all of them are generated out of opposites? Yes. And is this universal opposition of all things? Are there not also two immediate processes which are ever going on from one to the other and back again? Where there is a greater and a less, there is also an intermediate process of increase and diminution, and that which grows is said to wax. And check something real quick. Said to wax. What was it about wax? Oh, here we are. Oh, here. Process of increase and diminution, and that which grows is said to wax, and that which decays to wane. Yes, he said. And there are many other processes, such as division and composition, cooling and heating, which equally involve a passage into and out of one another. And this holds for all opposites, even though not always expressed in words, they are generated out of one another, and there is a passing or process from one to the other of them. Very true, he replied. Well, and is there not an opposite to life, as sleep, and an opposite of waking? True, he said, and that is death, he answered. And these then are generated if they are opposites and one from another, and have their two intermediate processes also, of course. Now, said Socrates, I will analyze one of the two pairs of opposites, which I have mentioned to you, and also its intermediate processes, and you shall analyze the other to me. The state of sleep is opposed to the state of waking, and out of sleeping, waking is generated, and out of waking, sleeping is the process of generation, is in the one case falling asleep, and in the other waking up. Do you agree about that? Quite agreed. Then suppose that you analyze life and death to me in the same manner. Is not death opposed to life? Yes. And they are generated one from the other? Yes. What is generated from life? Death. And what from death? I can only say in answer, life. Then the living, whether things or persons, sebes, are generated from the dead. That is clear, he replied. Then the inference is that our souls are in the world below. That is true. And one of the two processes or generations is visible. For surely the act of dying is visible. Surely, he said. And may not the other be inferred as the complement of nature, who is not to be supposed to go on one leg only? And if not a corresponding process of generation in death, must also be assigned to her? Certainly, he replied. And what is that process? Revival. And revival, if there is such a thing, is the birth of the dead into the world of the living. Quite true. Then there is a new way in which we arrive at the inference that the living come from the dead, just as the dead come from the living. And if this is true, then the souls of the dead must be in some place out of which they come again. And this, as I think, has been satisfactorily proved. Yes, Socrates, he said, all this seems to flow necessarily out of our previous admissions, and that these admissions are not unfair, sebes, he said, may be shown, as I think, in the way in this way. If generation were in a straight line only and there were no compensation or circle in nature, no turn or return into one another, then you know that all things would at last have the same form and pass into the same state, and there would be no generation of them. What do you mean? He asked. A simple thing, a simple thing enough, which I will illustrate by the case of sleep, he replied. You know that if there were no compensation of sleeping and waking, the story of the sleeping Endymion would in the end have no meaning, because all other things would be asleep too, and he would not be thought of. Or if there were composition only, and no division of substance, then the chaos of Anaxagoras would come again. And in like manner, my dear Cebes, if all things which partook of life were to die, and after they were dead remained in the form of death, and did not come to life again, all would at last die, and nothing would be alive. How could this be otherwise? For if the living sprang from any others who are not the dead, and they die, must not all things at last be swallowed up in death? There is no escape from that, Socrates, said Cebes, and I think that what you say is entirely true. Yes, he said, Cebes, I entirely think so too, and we are not walking in a vain imagination. But I am confident in the belief that there truly is such a thing as living again, and that the living spring from the dead, and that the soul of the dead are in existence, and that the good souls have a better portion than the evil. Cebes added, your favorite doctrine, Socrates, that knowledge is simply recollection, if true, also necessarily implies a previous time in which we learned that which we now recollect. But this would be impossible unless our soul was in some place before existing in the human form. Here, then, is another argument of the soul's immortality. But tell me, Cebes, said Simmias, interposing, what proofs are given of this document of recollection? I am not very sure at this moment that I remember them. One excellent proof, said Cebes, is afforded by questions. If you put a question to a person in a right way, he will give a true answer of himself. But how could he do this unless there were knowledge and right reason behind already in him? And this is most clearly shown when he is taken to a diagram or to anything of that sort. But if, said Socrates, you are still incredulous, Simmias, I would ask you whether you may not agree with me when you look at the matter in another way. I mean, if you are still incredulous as to whether knowledge is recollection. Incredulous I am not, said Simmias, but I want to have this doctrine of recollection brought to my own recollection, and from what Cebes has said, I am beginning to recollect that and be convinced. But I should still like to hear what more you have to say. This is what I would say, he replied. We should agree, if I am not mistaken, that what man recollects he must have known at some previous time. Very true. And what is the nature of this recollection? And in asking this, I mean to ask whether, when a person has already seen or heard or in any way perceived anything, and he knows not only that, but something else of which he has not the same, but another knowledge, we may not fairly say that he recollects that which comes into his mind. Are we agreed about this? What do you mean? I mean what I may illustrate by the following instance. The knowledge of a lyre is not a lyre, as in lyre, the instrument, is not the same as the knowledge of a man. True. And yet, what is the feeling of lovers when they recognize a lyre or a garment? or anything else which the beloved has been in the habit of using. Do not they, from knowing the lyre, form in the mind's eye an image of the youth to whom the lyre belongs? And this is recollection. And in the same way, anyone who sees Simmias may remember Cebes. And there are endless other things of the same nature. Yes, indeed, there are endless, replied Simmias. And this sort of thing, he said, is recollection, and is most commonly a process of recovering that which has been forgotten through time and inattention. Very true, he said. Well, and may you not also be seeing the picture of a horse or a lyre, remember a man? And from the picture of Simmias, you may be led to remember Cebes. True. Or you may also be led to the recollection of Simmias himself. True, he said. And in all these cases, the recollection may be derived from things either like or unlike. That is true. And when the recollection is derived from like things, then there is sure to be another question, which is whether the likeness of that which is recollected is in any way defective or not. Very true, he said. And shall we proceed a step further and affirm that there is such a thing as equality, not of wood with wood or of stone with stone, but that over and above this, there is an equality in the abstract? Shall we affirm this? Affirm yes, and swear to it, replied Simmias, with all the confidence in life. And do you know the nature of this abstract essence? To be sure, he said. And whence did we obtain this knowledge? Did we not see equalities of material things, such as pieces of wood and stones, and gather them from the idea of an equality which is different from them? You will admit that. Or look at the matter again in this way. Do not the same pieces of wood or stone appear at one time equal and at another time unequal? That is certain. But are real equals ever unequal? Or is the idea of equality ever inequality? That surely was never yet known, Socrates. Then these so-called equals are not the same with the idea of equality. I should say clearly not, Socrates. And yet, from these equals, although differing from the ideas of equality, you conceived and attained that idea. Very true, he said. Which might be like or might be unlike them. Yes, but that makes no difference. Whenever from seeing one thing you conceived another, whether like or unlike, there must surely have been an act of recollection. Very true. But what do you say of equal portions of wood and stone, or other material equals? And what is the impression produced by them? Are they equal in the same sense of absolute equality, or do they fall short in this in a measure? Yes, he said, in a very good measure too. And must we not allow that when I or anyone look at any object and perceive that the object aims at being some other thing, but falls short of and cannot attain to it, he who makes this observation must have had previous knowledge of that to which, as he says, the other, although similar, was inferior. Certainly. And has not this been our case in the matter of equals and of absolute equality? Precisely. Then we must have known absolute equality previously to the time when we first saw the material equals, and reflected that all these apparent equals aim at this absolute equality, but fall short of it. That is true. And we recognize also that this absolute equality has only been known and can only be known through the medium of sight or touch or of some other sense. And this, I would affirm, of all such conceptions. Yes, Socrates, as far as the argument is concerned, one of them is the same as the other. And from the senses, then, is derived the knowledge that all sensible things aim at an idea of equality, rather, of which they fall short. Is not that true? Yes. Then before we begin to see or hear or perceive in any way, we must have had a knowledge of absolute equality, or we could not have referred to that the equals which are derived from the senses. For to that they all aspire, and of that they fall short. That, Socrates, is certainly to be inferred from the previous statements. And did we not see and hear and acquire our other senses as soon as we were born? Certainly. Then we must have acquired the knowledge of the ideal equal at some time previous to this. Yes. That is to say, before we were born, I suppose. True. I'm going to stop this here. We have been reading from Harvard Classics, but specifically we've been reading from Phaedo by Plato. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.